In this video, I'd like to review some of the basic principles that we've seen, but I'd like to review them in the context of one of the hypothalamic hormones. So let me begin by drawing the hypothalamic pituitary connection and the anterior pituitary or adenohypophyses and the posterior pituitary or neurohypophyses. Now we know that there's 8 hormones that are made up here in the hypothalamus. And 6 of those hormones are going to communicate with the anterior pituitary, causing the release of some of these anterior pituitary hormones that can then go and affect other organs. And really the first step is knowing the different organs and which hormones they make. Now, here I've drawn a couple organs. This is both the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands behind it. Okay. Now, we have a laundry list of questions that we need to answer. And the first one is the names of the hormones. The second question we can ask is what organ makes that hormone? What organ makes that hormone? We can also ask what specific cell makes that hormone. We can also ask how that cell makes the hormone. Now, if my list is deviating a little bit from the previous one, or one that maybe you've come up with, don't worry, there's a million different ways to divide this up. But I'm just kind of thinking about the journey of a hormone from beginning to end. The next thing that would happen after the cell makes the hormone is it might store it or release it right away. And when it releases it, we can ask where it's released from. What organ secretes or releases the hormone? And what specific cell secretes that hormone within that organ? Then we can ask, once it's secreted, how it travels through the blood. Then we can ask, what's its target organ? What is the hormone's target organ? What's its target cell? Target cell. How it binds to its target. Or where does it bind? To the target. What effect it has on that target. What would hypersecretion or too much of it cause? What about hyposecretion? Not enough of it. You can also ask, what stimulated its release in the first place? To cause it to be released? And what's going to inhibit it? And that's where we get into the most recent discussion or basic principle we learned about negative feedback. What inhibits its release? Okay, so this here is 15 questions. Whether you divide it up into 14 or 16, it's really up to you. But let's do this one in the case of the hypothalamic hormone thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, or some people will say thyroid releasing hormone. Okay, the names for it is thyrotropin releasing hormone or thyroid releasing hormone. What organ makes it? Well, that would be the hypothalamus. This organ here, hypothalamus. And what specific cells make it? Well, I can say TRH producing cells of the hypothalamus. This group of nuclei, you don't need to know the name of it, that just make this thyroid releasing hormone. TRH producing cells, we'll call them, of the hypothalamus. Now, how does that cell make it? Well, because I know where it's made, and this was one of the keys. I actually left it off my list here, but one of the keys to understanding the hormones is to understand its chemical class. And I know that the chemical class for TRH, I know that the chemical class for TRH is going to be amino acid based. Now, how do I know that? I know that because I know my homunculus and I know where hormones are made, and I know that steroid hormones are only made in the gonads, that's testes, ovaries, placenta, or adrenal cortex. I also know that I have this organization in mind where I have the thyroid or the tyrosine derivatives. And I know that tyrosine derivatives include the catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, and the two thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. I know that if it's not steroid based, because it's not made in any of those organs I mentioned, and it's not the catecholamines or the thyroid hormones, those tyrosine derivatives, I know that it must be amino acid based. This is an amino acid based hormone because it's made in the hypothalamus. Even though it has that word thyrotropin in it, it's not a thyroid hormone. It's not a tyrosine derivative, therefore. Okay? It's not T3 triiodotyrosine or thyroxine. No, this is thyroid releasing hormone or thyrotropin releasing hormone. Okay, we know the names because we learn those names. We know the organs that make those hormones because we study our homunculus. We know the chemical class using this organization I've shown you in previous videos. Now, how the cell makes an amino acid based hormone? Well, this is the same way that any cell makes an amino acid based hormone. First, within that TRH producing cell, we have a nucleus that has DNA. And on that DNA, there's a gene. And that gene codes for the protein TRH. We transcribe that gene into messenger RNA, and we send it out into the cytosol after adding a 5' cap and a poly A tail. There's a little top hat. And when we send it out into the cytosol, a rough ER ribosome is going to translate that protein into the pre or pro hormone. And it's going to be encapsulated in this little vesicle, this pre or pro hormone. Now, this pre or pro hormone is going to undergo some modification at the Golgi apparatus, and then leave the cell. Now it's going to enter that Golgi apparatus at the cis phase, and it's going to leave from the trans phase. And by the time it leaves, this hormone that's encapsulated in this vesicle will be in its finished, polished form. And when the cell is stimulated to release TRH, we'll talk about that in a bit, this vesicle's going to move to the membrane and dump its contents out. Well, that's the TRH we see here. And TRH can get right into the bloodstream because we know its chemical class, and amino acid-based hormones are water-soluble hormones. These are water-soluble hormones, so they can dissolve right into the blood and be carried to the target. Now, what's its target? The anterior pituitary. Don't say the thyroid gland. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone's target is the anterior pituitary. That's where we're going to find TSH-producing cells. That's the specific cell that it targets. TSH, thyroid-stimulating hormone, producing cells of the anterior pituitary. And when it binds to this TSH-producing cell, we're going to learn in an upcoming video how amino acid-based hormones affect their targets. But it's going to bind to a receptor on the cell surface, and through a second messenger system cause this TSH-producing cell to release a hormone of its own, TSH. So, what is its target organ? The anterior pituitary, because I understand that hypothalamic pituitary target axis. What's the target cell? TSH-producing cells, because I know the corresponding hormones between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. How it binds to its target? I know where it's going to bind the cell surface because I understand its chemical class. Now, this is probably where you're going to need to put in the most study. Understanding the effect these hormones have on their targets. Now, in this case, it's very simple. It causes its target to release TSH. It's right there in our name. It causes the release of thyrotropin. And thyrotropin changes the thyroid gland. Another name for thyrotropin is thyroid stimulating hormone. So it's right there in the name. Thyrotropin releasing hormone or thyroid releasing hormone is going to cause the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. Now I'm going to take us a step further to better understand hypersecretion and hyposecretion of this stuff. Well, too much of it and you're going to have too much TSH. Too little and you're going to have too little TSH. But what does that mean for the feedback loops we learned? Well, to understand that, we need to understand what TSH does. TSH is going to affect cells of the thyroid gland. And the cell types it's going to affect in the thyroid gland are going to be follicular cells. Follicular cells surround this thing called a follicle. Kind of like the follicle in the ovary. A follicle is kind of this fluid-filled bag that's protective. And TSH will bind to the follicular cells in the thyroid gland, and they're going to bind on the cell surface. How do I know? Because I know the chemical class for TSH. It's an amino acid-based hormone. I know that because it's not one of the steroid hormones. It's not made in the placenta, the adrenal cortex, or the gonads, testes or ovaries. It's also not one of the tyrosine derivatives, the catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, or thyroid hormones, the other tyrosine derivatives. T3, triiodotyrosine, or thyroxine, T4. No, this is TSH and it's made by the anterior pituitary. It's amino acid based, and amino acid based hormones can't pass the lipid bilayer of the cell, so it needs to bind on the cell surface. And when it does, it's going to cause these cells to release a hormone of their own. And that's T3 or T4, the thyroid hormones. And those thyroid hormones are going to get into the blood. Now, these are tyrosine derivatives. And these tyrosine derivatives, with many exceptions, behave like steroid-based hormones. They need a protein carrier to get through the blood. We call that thyroid binding protein. TBP, thyroid binding protein. These cannot bind to the outside of cell membranes. No, they bind within the cell, actually to the DNA. These are going to behave more like steroid-based hormones. And what they do is they're going to increase metabolism. Now, I could find volumes of textbooks about what these things do. They have many, many different effects throughout the body. What I'm going to hold you accountable for is anything that resembles increasing metabolism, increasing body temp, faster heart rate, more cellular energy, increase in ATP production. All these things go along with higher metabolism, increased growth in protein synthesis, all these things are increased metabolism. Don't get bogged down by charts and textbooks that lay out a million different functions of this stuff. Save that when you become a researcher and are studying these individually. For now, just remember, increase in metabolism, and thyroid hormone has permissive effects on growth and development. On growth and development, on protein synthesis. Growth and development. Okay, now that we know what TRH does and what the hormone that TRH causes the release of, what it does to a cell, and what its hormone does to the body, we can understand what is going to feed back to inhibit or cause the release of TRH. So basically, hypersecretion of this stuff is going to lead to increased metabolism and increased growth and development. That disorder is called a syndrome of inappropriate TRH production. Okay? There's also a disorder called Graves' disease. And in Graves' disease, the symptoms are similar to hypersecretion of TRH. In Graves' disease, ultimately you're ending up with too much of the effect of T3, T4. It's actually an autoimmune disease where the antibodies the body produces mimic or copy T3 and T4. So they can bind to the receptors of target cells here in the nucleus, actually, to increase that cell's metabolism and growth and development. So Graves' disease is essentially like hypersecretion of T3, T4, which would be because, or could be because of too much secretion of TSH, which would be because of too much secretion of TRH. So ultimately, to understand this hypersecretion, too much of this stuff, we need to know its final effects. In Graves' disease, these people can develop a condition called exophthalmos, this bulging of the eyes, high heart rates, high body temperatures, increased metabolism, and even increase in growth and development, depending on the age. Now, hyposecretion of this stuff, or too little, is going to result in a disorder called mixed edema in adults, or cretinism in children. Cretinism in children. Myxedemia, you're going to have slower metabolism, so lower body temperatures, lower heart rate, lower ATP production, even weight gain. Sluggish thinking, because the neurons just don't have enough of all this stuff going on to really energize the cells and conduct nerve impulses properly. Now, in a child who's still growing and developing, they're going to end up with growth and development problems. They could even end up as what's called a pituitary dwarf, because this hormone allows growth to occur. And without it, you don't have this, which means you don't have this, which means your cells don't grow. So, also you can get some mental retardation with cretinism. Not only growth retardation, but also maldevelopment of the brain. Things aren't developing quite normally. Okay, so what's going to stimulate its release? Well, lack of all the things that it does. If we're cold, if we have a low heart rate, not enough energy production, no protein synthesis, this is going to send a signal to increase TRH, which would increase TSH, which would increase T3, T4, which would bring us back to homeostasis, decreasing the original stimulus in the first place, which was lack of these things. Now, what's going to inhibit its release? Too much of all these things. When we have too much of all these things, those signals are going to feed back and inhibit inhibit the hypothalamus from producing TRH, which inhibits TSH, which inhibits the release of T3, T4, which reduces body temperature, heart rate, ATP, protein synthesis, and growth and development, and brings us back into a homeostatic or a balance point when we have too much of this going on. So it's really T3, T4 and its effects that are going to come back to inhibit TRH. Now with this one, it also feeds back to inhibit TSH. It's that final effect, all these things, and T3, T4, that will feed back to inhibit these. Now, lacking these things are going to feed back. Lack of this is actually going to stimulate it. Lack of these things will stimulate this. Lack of these things may even stimulate TSH in itself. So, we've just generated the list knowing where the hormone's made and its names, its chemical class, a basic principle of how these behave and where they can travel in the body and how they're made. We'll talk more about how they affect cells through second messenger systems. We had to spend some time talking a little bit about what effects they have. And from that, we can think of what hypersecretion, hyposecretion, stimulus, and inhibition comes from. We did need to memorize some names for some disorders of not necessarily too much T3, T4, but basically too much of something that mimics it or copies it. And the disorders associated with too little. So there I've applied some of the basic things that we've picked up. We still need to learn how it binds to its target, whether it's steroid-based, amino acid-based, or a tyrosine derivative. And we also need to learn a little something about these permissive, synergistic, or antagonistic effects of hormones, their relationships. We're also going to see circadian rhythms and different categories of stimuli, neural, humoral, or hormonal.